Perhaps what we can just do is make some household arrangements. First of all, the meeting is being recorded, so if anyone has an objection to the meeting recorded, please voice your objection now. The reason we'd like to record it is so we can make this available to members that are not able to attend in person today, but they can still sit and watch the webinar at their convenience later on. If we can also ask participants to keep their microphones muted, so if we do have any members of the Heavy Breathing Society, it won't override the presenter's narrative. So just keep the microphones muted. If people have any questions, the agenda for this morning's meeting is we're going to be going through the keynote speech by Dr. Tim van Rooij, and then we're going to have the panel discussion with Dr. Tim and Professor Rachel Tribe and Professor Jacqui Akhurst, who I see has not joined us quite yet. I hope he does. And if you have any questions or comments, please pop them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We don't have a Q&A box for this presentation. So just post your questions or comments in the chat box, and then we will go through those during the Q&A session after the presentation and panel discussion. So, having covered the housekeeping arrangements, perhaps what we can do is launch into the webinar. And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Tim van Rooij. And I've got a brief bio to introduce him here. Dr. Tim is a counseling psychologist based in Dublin who specializes in emotion-focused therapy for marginalized individuals and romantic partners. With a background in social work and counseling psychology, Tim's research, clinical practice, and workshops navigate the intersection of emotions, relationships, sexuality, and LGBTQIA plus experiences. So yes, Dr. Tim was initially a social worker, and then he saw the light, and he now has a PhD in counseling psychology. He's one of us now. His work is informed by years of therapeutic practice and a deep commitment to advancing social justice in mental health. Additionally, his interests extend to emotional intelligence within organizational consulting and leadership coaching, bridging clinical insights and broader societal impacts. And I can say for the brief period that I've come to know Dr. Tim online, he's a person who's very passionate about social justice and advocacy. He not only talks about it and writes about it, but he practices it and is actually out there advocating for social change and justice. So with that, Dr. Tim, I'd like to hand over to you, and if you could take us through your presentation, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So while I raise my desk, I prefer to do this standing. Let's see if you can see this around. Can you see that okay? I see some nodding, I think.
Yes, indeed, we can. It's clear.
Oh, great. Right. Okay. So thank you so much for having me, and thanks for introducing me, Michael. Probably won't have much to add to that. I've set up my screen in a way that I can see some of your faces and I can see my presentation. I hope my overlay is not too disturbing there. So I'll just briefly show you an outline. I'll introduce myself if I have anything to add, really. I'll talk briefly about the aims for today. Then my main objective is really to talk about what is social justice. And my main hope, obviously, I don't quite know who's here in the audience, and I don't quite know where you stand with social justice, but I suppose part of my motivation today is to communicate that you can do this and try and sort of break down what social justice is. I find that often people are quite taken back by the term, or it's very abstract or vague or large, and I suppose it is, yes, but there's certainly things we can do. So I try and break it down and give you some examples of how I try and integrate this, or things I know of, to help you maybe do this yourself as well. So no, this is from my contact information. Timpsychology.com is my website if anyone is interested, or my LinkedIn if anyone is ever interested in a chat or collaborating. Feel free to drop me a message. Part of what I'll also extend myself to introduce in introductions is my pronouns are he, him. I'm a cisgender man. I'm queer, gay. I'm white, European, and I'm neurodivergent, dyslexic. And in terms of citizenship, I'm a Dutch citizen living in Ireland. Going with the theme of today, and I'll talk more about that in a second. I feel like that's important to acknowledge where I come from and where I stand. This is just a lovely picture of my absolutely gorgeous office. I think so. I include that just as part of my introduction, that you get a bit of a vibe, but also to show that the only thing that maybe you can see here is the pride flags, the rainbow flags. Can you see my mouse actually when I move that? So you know what I'm pointing at. Yeah,
Yes,
okay,
we can.
great.
We're following it.
Super. So again, I'll come back to those flags in a moment because they're very, very purposeful. There's something on the right-hand side. There's a lamp that you might just see behind my chairs, and there's something on the left as well. But at least in this picture, you get a sense. So yeah, main goal today is to help you break it down and help you feel that you can do this, right? Um, so let's talk about what is social justice really. So social injustice, right? So the injustice has many different impacts. Let me spotlight that. There we go. So the impacts on an individual level is it's one of many factors that we know contribute to mental health challenges, right? There's internalized unhelpful strategies. So really the way we tend to talk about this in the literature is internalized oppression. So the way people are treated in society, they may start treating themselves like that, which I suppose to many of us is a very familiar concept, right? So the same goes to the injustice people have experienced. And then there is systemic and economic barriers. Try and keep that there. Systemic economic barriers to mental health care. The relational impact of the injustice may also be the not quite trusting the systems that are out there designed to support you, right? Not everyone has equal access to healthcare or academic systems or legal systems, etc. So people with marginalized backgrounds may actually struggle to access them. This is where social justice comes in, right? This is part of our therapy. We need to be aware of this. We need to be aware of our own background, our own privileges that we have, but also the people that we work with and maybe the challenges they face in order to access these systems. And maybe not to take it for granted that, well, sure, there's a legal system there. Well, sure, there's an academic system there. Why don't you use it kind of way? Um, there's a social isolation element to it. People tend to withdraw because they have negative experience maybe in these larger societal systems. And then this is definitely also part of the intergenerational trauma that I think we're all too familiar with what that is. Societal impact then is on a societal level, there's almost a normalization of injustice, and gender pay gaps, for example, is one very common example of how this is just the norm and this is just what happens. And I know we're pushing back against it, but yet for so long that was the status quo. Workplace discrimination, racial profiling. I mean, the amount of examples I've heard in therapy, for example, around racial profiling in school interviews, airports, people are being picked out of the line just because they look a certain way. Right, it's almost normalization. It just seems to happen. Whereas, again, that are injustices that may happen on an everyday level for some people. It's also the idea that mental health is political, that the systemic impact is not an individual pathology. So we cannot ignore that part of what we do is also something political. It's not just focused on the individual that's sitting in front of us, but there's a political element to it. They are there because they somehow have access, or depending on the service you work in, right? There's a particular route they came in with, the particular challenges they faced. All of them didn't happen in a vacuum. This person lived in a context with a society full of regulations and policies that may have limited them in certain ways, or made life easier in other ways. So again, I'm speaking a bit abstract here, but to some extent, it's this idea of just coming by, thriving, or sorry, surviving rather than thriving. So self-actualization, right? So in part of our Rogerian theories and the humanistic triangles is that some people may not be able to actually thrive because they're so busy surviving, they're so busy fighting all the microaggressions or the injustices that are part of their life. Hope that all makes sense so far. So then what is social justice, right? So really, at its core, it's a fair and equitable access and opportunity for all. That's social justice in general. So what about this in therapy, right? In therapy, there's a really important concept that I want to touch on, and that's the idea of cultural humility and self-reflexivity. So cultural humility versus cultural competence. I think in recent times, there's been a lot of talk about cultural competence. And I want to argue against that concept because there is cultural competence, which implies there's an endpoint, there's a learning end goal to being competent in the cultural framework. Whereas we cannot ever truly understand all the intersections and all the cultures that are out there in combination with the privileges and the power dynamics that we hold ourselves. And I'm mentioning a few terms that I'll touch on in a second, so if you bear with me. Cultural humility, instead, is the concept of an ongoing process and an awareness that you're never going to know it all. It's a humility that you know plenty, right? As a counseling psychologist, you know plenty about culture, you know plenty about what impacts a person's life, but it's not pretending, well, I'm culturally competent, therefore I know all cultures, so you must be impacted that, right? So it's really bringing back that humanistic understanding and openness to tell me how that's going for you. So it's recognizing that you have blind spots, that you have a background, that, as I introduced myself, I'm a white cis guy. So I have a certain background from the Netherlands, in my case, living in Ireland. So I'm going to naturally or innately have experienced certain cultures directly through personal experiences, and there's certain experiences that are maybe more foreign to me. Doesn't mean I can't relate, doesn't mean I can't apply my cultural humility to explore this with someone and really get to know their experience. So what we need in here is a curiosity and an openness to new insights and new experiences, really this exploration. It's a collaborative approach. It's not a directive approach, I know it all. It's the exploring it with a person, right? So it's a self-reflection on your own values, your own privileges, your own powers, your own biases, which is really, 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 really important in this. And I keep hammering on about that as we go, because knowing where you come from is a fundamental part of being able to relate to this other person with a kindness and with an understanding, like, hey, we're here together and I'm here for you as your psychologist. And I'm going to understand so much of your experience, and some of it I'm not going to understand, but I understand what it's like for you, right? So that's the humility aspect of it. So self-reflection, then, at the core, it's the fundamental part of us as counseling psychologists. Social justice in itself has a massive history in counseling psychology. So I'd argue this is not per se foreign to us. But often I find in trainings, it's not maybe very explicit. I think counseling psychology training or any psychology training is so busy getting you ready as a counseling psychologist, which is already complex enough as it is, let alone maybe how you then acknowledge yourself or how you bring that in, how you invite these dynamics from my clients. So it's being mindful of that. This is really talking about ongoing self-reflection, about journaling, chats with peers, with colleagues, reflecting on clients' experiences, bringing it to supervision, hopefully a supervisor that invites these multiple identities that you've got as well. I've used the word intersectionality a few times. So intersectionality is the interplay of various identity parts and how they bring power or privilege or powerlessness and lack of privilege. And I added the word socially constructed because many of these are socially constructed, these identities. And I think it's really important to know that intersectionality is really important. And I think often we're mistaken in terms of counting your intersections. I've done it myself. I'm trying to find out, like, how many do I have? But like I did in my introduction, it's acknowledging that's relevant to the context that I work in. It's relevant to the context that I come from, right? So it's culturally specific. If you live in a different part of the world, the same identities that you hold may not be clashing as much, or they may have a very different impact. So it's not universal, right? So hence socially constructed experience. It's context dependent. Marginalization is the systemic negative impact of the lack of power and privilege. It's the idea of death by 1,000 paper cuts. So obviously, the lovely people that we work with tend to be very resilient. It's still the idea of holding death by 1,000 paper cuts, just microaggression after microaggression or injustice after injustice can still feel like a death by 1,000 paper cuts because you're still bleeding out by that point, basically. So just a question to pose back to you. You don't have to answer it right now, but it's just what are some of the privileges that you hold, right? And maybe try and reflect on that as we talk about this today. What is it that you bring to the table? So then how do we address social justice in therapy? just want to plug my upcoming article with my co-authors, Robert Elliott and Dominique Mertens. So we've written an article from an EFT lens around marginalized experiences. It's in press, so can't say too much about it yet, but I hopefully keep an eye out on it, and relatively soon I hope this is published. So one of the arguments that I'd make is the dark side of humanism, even though I really value humanism, and it's obviously one of the fundamental cores of us as counseling psychologists. It's the over-individualization, and it's locating the problem at all times within the person, and it may be, right? But it's also over-individualizing it, whereas everything I've talked about the last, quick look, 5, 6 minutes, is talking about context, the experience, the environment people grow up in. So it's also the acknowledgement that privilege can shield from some additional pain, while marginalized experiences, marginalized individuals, often face lifelong challenges rooted in systemic barriers. So it's not to say that if you have privileges, life is easy. That if you're someone who's got all the privileges since you were born and never too many challenges, doesn't mean life was easy. It just means that some of the additional challenges that maybe your neighbors who were a different skin color or were not white or who were queer or different social economic status or a different age may have had additional hurdles to deal with. And that all in all contributes to this sense of having to work twice as hard to get the same promotions. Having to work 2 or 3 times as hard to get into the same universities, to just keep your head above water, right? So I hope that makes sense there. It's by no point I'm saying that privilege is bad. Absolutely not. It's fantastic. Happy for you. Great. It's the acknowledgement that there's another side to it. People who may experience additional challenges. So, right, yeah, intersections can compound the emotional injuries from systemic injustice or oppression, right? So it's the compounding, privilege can shield, etc. So a client's pain cannot be fully understood without the explicit acknowledgement and the exploration of the lived experience from injustice. So we need to be fine-tuned to hearing that little sliver that someone might hint at, that they may feel treated a little different in work. That's it. That's what we need to explore. Because at least in my experience, I'd love to hear afterwards, from all your experiences. In my experience, people don't volunteer that. They don't outright say, "Oh, hey, discrimination," or "Hey, racism in my workplace." So it's really inviting that. When it goes unacknowledged, it's in a way therapy contributes to the oppression, to the being silent, to it being a you problem. So this comes back to that point of the over-individualization, right? This is when it can be unintentionally hurtful or damaging if we don't catch that, if we don't speak out, like, hey, that's not right. I know that's maybe part of the world right now, but wouldn't it be great if we lived in a world where this wasn't part of your reality, where you didn't need to, I don't know, spend 50% of your daily energy on X, Y, and Z challenges? This is a quote from our own paper that we published last summer. So, in the applied practice, valuing social justice means understanding the individual within their context, within their culture, within their larger systems. Counseling psychology, and now my videos of you are covering this. Counseling psychology considers how systems of oppression from an intersectional perspective may impact the multiple positionalities that individuals and groups can have. So just to quote ourselves there as the Global Counselling Psychology Forum, where we acknowledged how social justice is very much a part of counselling psychology and has always been. And as I did that, my mouse got frozen. There we go. So in therapy, practical application, I'll try and sort of fire some things at you and let me know how it lands. So a primary rule really is ongoing and self-reflection, learning about your own intersections, learning about your own privileges, learning about your own marginalizations that you bring to the table. Arguably, and I don't know if I have that somewhere, so it's on my mind, so let me just name that right now, is if you hold privileges, right? So I think one of the most valuable things we can do is then use our privilege to amplify the voices of those who are more marginalized. Right, so just want to plug that in there. I don't think I have that written down somewhere. So one approach that we also talk about in the article is broaching. So it's really the technique of very kindly and gently inviting the client to explore and name the systemic issue. It's that example that I mentioned earlier. It's that sliver of acknowledgement that, hey, maybe I feel treated just that little different in work. Or hey, my travel back or away from here in the airport and, it was really difficult. And then if we explore that, it might turn out that, 4 out of 5 times this person is pulled out of line just because they wear a hijab or they have a particularly thick beard or something. So there's racial profiling potentially going on there. And we're not going to know, right? Because we weren't there. So again, our stance then is it's validating and exploring that with the person and the acknowledgement that, gosh, this mightn't be the first time you've had this, right? What's that like? What does that do to you? So terminology here, I'm very emotion focused, therapy focused. So some of my language might be very emotion focused, heavy. So the empathic exploration in the individual in context. So it's the deepening, the validating, and the impact of the systemic hurt. So it's the exploring of what is that then like for you when you have that. The same when this happens between us. If I accidentally misgender a trans or non-binary person, it's sometimes exploring that and what's that like for you, because I know I just slipped up there, but you might have that all day, every day. And what's that like for you? And maybe we can talk about that, right? Although with gendering, there's also something to argue around correcting and moving on and not making a big deal out of it, right? Because especially when people are in transition periods. So obviously it depends, as it is with many of our work, it depends on how it goes in therapy. It depends on your connection and your relationship with this person. But it's really in many different ways exploring the larger systemic hurt, not just, oh, well, you're sensitive to being picked out of the line in the airport. No, what's that like? Because it's sort of like, I trust that you say this happened a lot, right? What's that like? So my prompt here to reflect on for you is, how helpful is therapeutic neutrality? Because I don't think so, right? We're not neutral. This is political, as I said earlier. We can inadvertently and unintentionally contribute to the silencing that's part of it. And I know that's none of our intentions, but hence I try and sort of break it down like, this is it, right? This is part of what you can do. So this is a lot. So take a moment. This is Wheel of Intersectionality and Privilege. Maybe some of you have seen this, maybe. Yes. So these are many intersectionalities broken down. So the idea is the more central to the circle here, the more empowered or privileged you might be if you fall with different identities in there. Then more marginalized and more oppressed or erased on the outer circles. This wheel, as it very rightfully so says, is as observed in the US. This is a US-centric circle. Doesn't mean it applies to where you live, or some of these things may look different. I have a copy of this in my therapy office. It's the one that I happened to find at the time with the most sort of slices of the wheel. So I found it really intriguing. I share this a lot with clients and we talk about it. So I also work a lot with romantic partners. So we may talk about the differences in the intersections between the partners or between me and them. So the red dots, that's me. That's where my privilege is, right? Based on this wheel. Again, if I were to make my own based on a Dutch person in an Irish context, it would look slightly different, but it's to get the conversation going. If anyone wants to collaborate on making a Euro-centric version, happy to do that or to translate that to different parts of the world, I think that'd be really great. Just because many of the others that I find have only maybe like 10 slices or something, or 6, like very few. What I really like about this one, which is very relevant here, is housing. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the housing market in Ireland, but it's terrible. So being a home owner is an enormous privilege, right? Public transport is questionable at times here and can certainly use improvement. So again, all these things feed into privilege or empowerment that the person may have or may not. So let's see what else is there. There's body size, skin color, neurodiversity. Hence I disclose I'm dyslexic. mental health, I'd consider stable, physical ability. I'm able-bodied, so I have no physical disabilities. I have no religion. I'd have grown up in a middle class and right now maybe be middle upper class. So age, I'm currently an adult. Education, obviously I did a doctorate, so it's highly educated, therefore more empowered. Homeowner, I drive. Seems like I missed one actually. Oh yeah, this is the political affiliation, right? Democrat, Republican. Doesn't quite translate to the context that I live in. I am not married. So yeah, I also work a lot with queer and open relationships, and so this is really important here as well that monogamous presenting relationships have a certain privilege, right? So I think it's really important to bring in, whereas people who have polyamory or openness may face lots more challenges. As far as I understand, you cannot legally get married with three people as a couple. Owning a house with more than two people is tricky, at least here. So it's those systemic challenges. Again, it's political that what we live in and also what your client lives in. Okay, I'll move on for now. We can always come back to this. This is because I happen to know lots around queer stuff. So I'll briefly plug this. This is the Rainbow Europe map. Just to show you some of the inequalities that are still going on for queer folk and LGBTQ folk. So the greener, the better in terms of legal and political equality. The more red, the least equality. So you can see here there's 2%, according to their framework, of legal and political equality in Russia. There's about 57% in Ireland, 62% in the UK. I think Malta tends to be the highest. Where is it? Malta is 88%. Iceland has about 83%. So this is about nuances, right, guys? So this is about not just equal rights to get married as same-sex folk. It's divorce rights. It's adoption rights as same-sex. It's adoption and then divorce rights as same-sex. And who remains parents? And are you both biological and non-biological? Do you have equal rights, etc., etc.? It's trans rights. It's non-binary rights. It's gender recognition. It's gender-affirming surgery. It's all of it, right? That they've sort of summarized. And now I'm very briefly plugging this to emphasize how important this is, that we're aware of these are the contexts that some of our people may work in. Now, I happen to know this one. I don't know the national, the global one that last year there were 64 countries globally where it's illegal to have private and consensual sex as a man with another man. Doesn't say anything about cultural norms or cultural values, but legally, you could be prosecuted. And that ranges from fines to being in jail to stoning, punishment, whips. 12 of these countries have death penalty on this. 14 of these countries discriminate the expression of transgender identity. I believe it just went down about 6 months ago from 64 to 63. I actually don't know which country that is that sort of dropped off there, which is really good news. So I'm just plugging that. This is the context of some of the people that we work with, or maybe their partners where they're from, or where they have worked for some years, or where they've traveled, right? So it's going to influence people. Now, I know social justice and marginalization is much more than sexuality, but so I happen to know the numbers on these, so I wanted to plug that. So of the 64, 40 of them explicitly discriminates for women. Again, private and consensual sex for women with other women. Anyway, I might have hammered on enough about why this is important. Okay, so the principles of social justice informed therapy. How am I doing with time? Can I just check, Michael? How far am I?
Yes, indeed, you're doing well, Tim. You've got another 15 minutes still.
Great, okay. Okay. generally three principles of social justice informed therapeutic practice. So there's relationally, socially just ethical practice. So ethical practice has a baseline. This is part of our field. Obviously, that needs to be part of social justice as well, making sure that it's ethical what we're doing. It's relationally ethical as well, meaning it's collaborative, it's respectful, it's compassionate, it's authentic relationships, it's together, not exploitive or instrumental or habitual, which would speak to the oppression and the marginalization people experience. And it's inseparable from social justice, that there are identities, there are social contexts, there is the history of the therapist, there's the history of the client and the client in the current space. They cannot be separated from social justice. That is part of it. We need to explore that or be part of that and acknowledge it. Second general core principle is this transformative practice. Therapeutic work can challenge, client's experience, but also challenge the status quo. I tend to acknowledge a lot, like, gosh, and sort of, I try and hold that balance of like, I know this is part of, maybe gender equality that you face out there and that's out there, but wouldn't it be great if we lived in a world where that wasn't part of reality? And I do sometimes bridge that with clients over time to, okay, what do you want to do with this? Because sometimes clients get really motivated, like, I want to do something about this. The amount of people I've had conversations with, and it turns into they becoming more socially active, social justice active on like Instagram, or they write an occasional blog post about it, or some people keep their head down for a long time and they write a book, or they start a podcast about little things that are relevant to them. And I suppose all of that is contributing to challenging the status quo and creating more equity for everyone. So it's promoting the individual and the societal and the political and the collective well-being all through our work. Social justice is as well a process as it is a goal. So it is just, I'd argue, for us to acknowledge this in therapy, to explore this in therapy, to maybe do more about this. I know I'm hammering on it about within therapy because I think that's how we may easily connect, and this is for many of us, maybe our everyday work. I will bring it to what we can do outside of therapy because it's as important. So it's a process as well as a goal. So social justice out there for everyone, equality, absolutely, that's what we need to strive for, as well as the process of acknowledging and exploring it. So it's the politically informed practice is the last core principle. It's the person is political. It's this feminist quote, very relevant. It's not about imposing your political decisions, but it's acknowledging the trauma, the hurt, and the process of therapy that constantly involves political systems. Whatever that is, just me acknowledging that I have a wait list. That's a system that isn't serving my clients, certainly not. It's a privilege for me to be in. I have a certain fee that I charge because I work privately, right? So, because I also have, had student debts and, I have to live a life, doesn't always serve my clients. Doesn't mean everyone can just reach me. So from a book that I'll plug in a second, and they talk about these core principles and they break it down really, really well in terms of the within therapy approach. So examples of integrating social justice within therapy is in the consultation, I ask people about their gender identity, their sexual identity, and their relational style. So more and more, instead of saying LGBTQ, I say GSRD. So it's gender and sexual and relational diverse blind populations. So I ask someone like, hey, just so that I don't make any assumptions, can I ask, are there particular gender or sexuality labels that you feel comfortable with or that you can express yourself in? Sometimes if people are confused, I ask, do you feel like a boy or a girl or neither or both, or anything in between and beyond? So basically, what are your pronouns that you want me to use to you as well? Would have a lot of folk who are in therapy because of gender and sexual challenges. So pronouns may differ from session to session. Sort of an agreement that we can check in and we can change that. Relational style is not assuming that everyone is monogamous or wants to be in a relationship or is in a relationship with one person, might be two or three or more, right? So it's maybe making that out in the open talking about it. Voicing inequalities, some of the examples that I gave earlier speak to that. Acknowledging gender status, skin color, etc. Purposefully addressing inequality in a person's life. So the oppression or the gender roles or the discrimination that they may hint at, where I find we need to drag that out. I remember in a consultation thinking to pick up on something about someone feeling treated differently in a work environment. And they sort of said, no, 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 it's fine, it's fine. And I sort of like a couple of sessions later, I sort of heard it again and I sort of explored it again. And this actually became such a meaningful and connecting session. We actually talked about discrimination and racism a lot. And this person became quite emotional and did end up sharing how they had never spoken with a white person about racism and how there was something quite odd and cathartic being able to just speak about that. So, what are your examples of how you may integrate social justice in your therapy, or maybe how you want to integrate it? So, not a prompt to leave you with as we go. So, what about beyond the therapy room? This is, although a smaller part of my keynote today, it's certainly not a small or unconsidered thing to practice. So there's direct client support, right? So there's within there's a direct client support. So it's empowering the clients, it's bridging the gaps. So you may even write client gender affirming letters or advocating for a client to take mental health leave, right? So it's again speaking to the injustice they may have experienced and therefore contributing to them having some mental health leave from work. A part of inclusive practice might be signage, like the pride flags that I have in my office. I have them there very visibly. I have some other pride signs in my office as well. This is my home office, actually. There's a pride flag behind me that you cannot see right now, I think. Just as a sign, like, hey, I'm queer myself. Hey, listen, we can chat about that. And I see people look at it, right? And it gets the conversation going. Bridging the gap, so reduced fee of your practice or access. Again, it's a part of it. Making social justice a topic to be talked about. And then this book here, Social Justice and Psychological Therapies, the editors are two counseling psychologists, actually, the names there. So I have it here. They have many, many, many good chapters, sorry. So they talked about marginalized and racial communities. They talk about intersectionality. There's a chapter on that. A chapter on social political frameworks, on social justice and societal class, disabilities, neurodiversity, sorry, gender, sexuality, refugee status, climate crisis, etc. So there are lots and lots of resources in there with co-authors contributed. Very, very helpful book. So then advocacy within our profession is as important. So shaping the profession, maybe educating peers, it's targeted workshops, CPD events or continuous professional development. We had one last year around challenging heteronormativity in the therapy room. Also arguing that heteronormativity isn't helpful for people who are heterosexual. It comes with certain biases, it comes with certain norms. That you need to have kids, for example. And a lot of people are exploring, do I actually want this? It's racial, queer identity, it's racism sensitivity trainings, it's EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, or JEDI, which is how we call it in our article. So it's justice, equality, diversity, inclusion. So it's integrating the social justice lens into it. Write articles, teach, lecture, share your knowledge, mentor people. Supervision should be part of that. Don't have that. Your psychological, be involved in committees and advocate for workshops on this. Challenge the inequalities within our profession because we're not immune to it, right? And I think as counseling psychologists, we may be all too familiar with some of the inequalities that we may face. So this talk is something I'm doing to challenge this. Right. So last year I was a chairperson of the Division of Counseling Psychology here in Ireland. I always said chairperson. It really bugged me that this was gendered. So many people always said, "Oh, so you're the chairman," and I don't know. It's part of my worldview. I'm like, there's nothing manly about this role. It's just I'm chairperson. So something I did is my signatures and the way I introduced myself. I just said chairperson. So people wouldn't say I was either chair or the chairman. I don't know. I didn't want it to be gendered. So that was one more effort. Mentoring, funding, I suppose a very relevant topic for us as counselling psychologists in Ireland. Only just since about a year, there is funding, a year and a half maybe, there's funding for the counselling psychology program that's here. I know in many parts of the world, and our last webinar spoke about this a lot. We were talking a lot about funding. So your advocacy or your involvement in that, writing to ministers or whatever is part of that, is also challenging inequalities within our profession, but arguably, hopefully, with a societal larger impact. Advocacy in the wider society, which is leaning a bit more on this book by Mick Cooper, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change. So he speaks about taking part in social transformation, not just individual healing, which I think is very near the concept I've been talking about so far as well. It's sharing your skills and your knowledge. He makes such a wonderful argument around we should be out there. If not us, then who knows so much about parenting? Who knows so much about attachment, about communication, about teaching styles? We need to be out there helping the teachers, helping the politicians, maybe being one of them ourselves. Nonviolent communication. It's this political involvement of supporting human understanding and well-being, because that's our art. That's also our science. So why not share it, right? Not just, and I know we're really busy maybe with our individual practices or our works, but everything you do can have a massive impact, right? It's sharing this with colleagues or with friends or being involved in your local elections or in however way it takes shape and form for you. I think really, really, really important. So yeah, whatever it's related to pay gaps, to immigration, asylum seeking, mental health within your country, for example, peaceful protests, it's advocating for change, challenging stigma and misinformation, take part in podcasts, blogs, social media, news, articles. There's all ways you can challenge misinformation. Actually try and do your bit to share what we consider or what you consider accurate information. And we can debate a lot about what's right and wrong within our profession as well. But it's about making that effort to contribute that and making that accessible. I know I'm going very fast, but I'm conscious of time. So I highly recommend his book as well. It's a really good read around, I don't think very much or maybe even at all he speaks about the within therapy, but it's about the outside of therapy and how we need to be there. So one of the final thoughts that I'll leave you with is, what is one step you can take today to integrate some social justice and advocacy in your practice or in your professional work? So these are some examples of Instagram posts that I would have made. So I talk a lot about sex on my social media. So this post here speaks about communication and sexual needs, right? So I work a lot with romantic partners. So it's debunking sexual myths and how turn-ons and turns-off work. This is from last year. This is one of those Pride posts that I made about 12 countries with a death penalty. Oops. I think I have more. How do I show this? Maintenance sex is one of the sexual styles. There we go. I made YouTube videos a good few years ago. Very laborious, very hard work. Moved away from it since, but maybe I'll come back to it. So you may recognize some of the topics I covered was like the Four Horsemen by Gottman, content styles, COVID a little bit, artwork, like I said, but some of the videos did really well. The contempt one is constantly being viewed still and constantly getting comments. I was quoted in this workplace article of romantic partners having a business together. So again, leaning on my work expertise and my so organizational and the romantic expertise. There's a wonderful app. I think it's Australian, if I'm right. So Everyday Racism, for 7 days, you get a notification and you play as a marginalized person. And you pick one of 4 characters or one of 3 characters. And then every day you get a text message about, hey, I was just treated like that in the airport. Or, hey, the bus driver looked at me like that. Or your friend. Anyway, so it's trying to get you to experience it as if this was you to, I suppose, evoke empathy. Really, really good. So these are some of the things that I would have shared, right, as a way of sharing information. These are a bunch of references. I'll leave it at that. I've highlighted some of the ones that I cited. So this is handbook that I mentioned. This is Mick Cooper's book. There's also a really good article around developing anti-oppressive practice, specifically targeting LGBT folk. All right. I'll take a breath and enjoy a sip of coffee, and I'll bring it back to the rest of the room.
Yeah, Dr. Tim, thank you so much for that presentation. We really appreciate the time and effort you put into drafting the presentation and taking time out from your schedule to present it to us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also a very thought-provoking conversation as well, because I can speak from my frame of reference that it certainly kind of pushed me into thinking somewhat differently about some of the things around social justice. So there we are, back to full screen. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go into a panel discussion, and I'm going to introduce and invite our panelists into the discussion with Dr. Tim. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in no specific order other than alphabetical. So the first one, we have Professor Jacqueline Akhurst from South Africa. She's an emeritus professor of Rhodes University, registered in both counseling and educational psychology in South Africa. She has also previously been a lecturer and academic at the University of Natal over many years. She's an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society, a DCOP member, and was the inaugural chair of the BPS Community Psychology section from 2010 to 2012. Her research focuses on community-based interventions using action research or activity theory. She's interested in critical community psychology perspectives on psychologist competencies, structured peer group supervision, and community-based service learning in universities. She has co-edited 2 community psychology texts, authored 51 journal articles, and 37 book chapters. She was the organizer of the European Congress of Community Psychology in 2011 and was part of a task force to promote community psychology in Europe, leading to membership of the subsequent EFPA Standing Committee from 2011 to 2015. She was awarded the UK Higher Education Academy International Scholarship in 2012-13 for facilitating student visits to Africa, and the Rhodes University Distinguished Community Engagement Award 2017. So welcome, Professor Jacqui. And our other panelist is Professor Rachel Tribe from the UK. Professor Rachel Tribe works within the School of Psychology at the University of East London and the Centre for Psychiatry and Mental Health, Barts, and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry, University of London, both located in the UK. She is a trustee of 3 international mental health charities, including CareIF. Professor Rachel Tribe is a chartered counseling and organizational psychologist who also holds an MBA and has qualifications in training and marketing. She's a fellow of the British Psychological Society and a registered HCPC psychologist. She has experience of working in the private, public, charity, and academic sectors. She's published 8 books. Her latest published book is Tribe and Bugra, 2025, Social Justice, Social Discrimination and Mental Health, Theory, Practice and Professional Issues, published by Brunner Routledge. All royalties from the book are going to a mental health charity, so punt, guys, go out there and look this book up. The funds are going to a good cause. Within the book, she's written a chapter with Ben Amponse, titled Advocacy Work Within Mental Health, an issue of social justice or an inappropriate challenge to professional neutrality. She's a member of the Human Rights Committee of the BPS and the World Association of Cultural Psychiatry. She's a member of the Special Interest Group of the World Psychiatric Association on Geopsychiatry and an advisory board member for the Institute of Geopsychiatry. She's currently engaged in working with colleagues on mental health projects and training in Sri Lanka, Senegal, and Pakistan. Details of her publications can be found at https://uel.ac.uk/about-uel/staff/Rachel-Tribe. So, Professor Rachel, thank you and welcome to our panel discussion as well. So, perhaps we can get the panel discussion going. So, maybe Dr. Tim, Professor Tribe, and Professor Jacqui, how would you like to start off the panel discussion? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start, Mike.
Thank you,
could I
Jacqui.
just check? Yes. Could I just check that the volume is okay?
Yes, indeed. We can hear you clearly.
Super. Thank you very much. So first of all, thanks very much to Yetundi for the original invitation to join this panel, and to Mike for facilitating all of this. It's wonderful to be part of this panel, and I flicked across to see who was listening and saying hello to my colleagues both in Australia and in the UK. So thank you very much. And then thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. I think it was an excellent synthesis of so many ideas to enable us to reflect on our position as counseling psychologists and our roles. And what particularly stood out to me was your comment about individualism and humanism and context. And as Mike has said, for me, having been trained here in South Africa, counseling psychology and community psychology have always strongly overlapped. And so this idea of not starting with the individual, but first of all, starting with the context and zooming in is for me very valuable. So yeah, that's just an initial comment. And
Thank
over
you.
to perhaps Rachel.
Thank you. Well, thank you again to all the organisers. I'm not going to take up valuable time by thanking them all individually, but you know how you are. And for also to Tim for an excellent presentation. I wasn't quite sure. I'm going to be honest and say I wasn't quite sure what my role was here as a discussant. So I've taken a few notes about what Tim said, and I just thought maybe I would summarize and then add a couple of things. I'm also very mindful that we don't want too much being talked at, so then to open it up and have a bit more discussion. And I think the things that if I met summary, it was a lovely picture to start with your consulting room, and that told us a lot about you, Tim. So thank you for that. And then definitions of social justice and the impact of social injustice. I also liked where you looked at the individual impact, the relational and the societal. I entirely agree what you said about cultural humility and reflexivity. And perhaps something we might think of as a group together is picking up from what you said, which was about recognition of our blind spots and how we do that. Because I think that's a very useful, if a painful task for all of us to do. You talked about intersectionality and social constructed identities. Again, a topic I think it would be good to talk a little bit more about. Context privileged, exploring the lived experience of people. And one of the things that perhaps I might just add into the mix of a really rich talk you gave was the importance of having service user engagement here. We have a whole history of colonialism, and I talk about some of the even the term says it, aid work, which I hate, is actually a form of neo-colonialism. I think there's quite a lot of difference between calling something aid work and humanitarian work. I've slightly lost what my point was there, so bear with me. Around socially constructed identities. And also a service user engagement. I think it's from the World Health Organization. They say something like, no decisions without me. And just wanted to comment about how we often see a kind of pseudo consultation or tokenism in these arenas, and thinking about how we might address those. I really love the wheel of intersectionality you showed, and I'd certainly be up for thinking about a European one. I hadn't seen that before, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through everything else you said, but I also really liked your description, if I heard you right, was Jedi. So you're going to put justice with EDI. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Excellent. So we can all think of ourselves as Jedi warriors.
Exactly.
Excellent talk. So let me open up the floor to anyone else.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you mentioned there, Dr. Tim, is, which was kind of, I don't want to say triggering, it provokes some thought, but you mentioned neutrality. And yeah, I have had a concern over many years, especially since I got involved with Ukrainian colleagues after the Russian invasion, and certain societies that I belong to try to take a very vanilla, neutral, atheoretical, apolitical, aethical stance about the matter because we should offend nobody. And I'm kind of curious to hear the panelists' views on, is this ever possible, or is everything we do political, and should it be political? And should we actually go and try and offend people? Because this whole concept of a sort of a blind, neutral position, and especially in the South African context, I mean, we've had many luminaries in South Africa who've said over the years that if you don't speak out against injustice or oppression, then we know which side you're on.
Okay.
So perhaps the panelists would just like to get over that. Is psychology something that should remain apolitical? Because in South Africa, we currently have some tensions where if you say anything about the political divide one way or the other, you're going to offend somebody. You cannot say anything without offending somebody. So I'm kind of curious to hear the panelists' views on neutrality and advocacy.
I think psychology can never. Sorry, Tim, did you want to?
No.
Spoken a lot, Tim.
No, exactly. I've spoken a
I'll
lot,
defer
so
to you and come back. So
Yeah.
after you, Tim.
No. You go. I've spoken plenty. I'm still catching my thirst.
Okay. Drink some more coffee. I was going to say, I think psychology can never be neutral, and I don't actually think a neutral position exists, if I'm honest. I think by taking a neutral position, you are actually taking a political position. So I think, I mean, we can think about what's going on in America now and how the APA and other organizations are responding to that. And I also just wanted to also, if I might pick up specifically on what you said, Michael, about Ukrainian people. And it was quite shocking in the UK when you compared what Ukrainian refugees were being offered, which was all sorts of support, people taking them into their houses, money, courses, lots of kind of virtual signaling around that. And if you compared that with, for example, somebody seeking asylum who came from Eritrea or the Middle East or somewhere, it was quite shocking. So I think and I have actually had some debates, would be the polite word, within the British Psychological Society about neutrality, because I think it's not possible and it doesn't help anyone. And I will be quiet now and pass over to Tim.
I just want to echo what you're saying. Yeah, I don't think we come from a history where, it sounds like as far as I understand it, I mean, I wasn't alive then, right? But the development of psychology was designed to be neutral, and we thought that was so powerful, and it still lingers, that hangover in our theories and our development and our training, that we should be neutral, which, as you're saying, Rachel, I don't think exists. I don't think we're truly neutral. We still have our biases. We still hold who we are. We cannot. I mean, I have an accent and stuff, right? I look a certain way. I show up with a certain way into the room as well. So we cannot pretend that that's not there. So why not address it and make it part of the space? And it's a really good point as well. You said, Michael, around this sounds very similar to the quote, I think, from Desmond Tutu around if an elephant is going to step on a mouse's tail and you don't speak up, the mouse isn't going to be happy. Right, that's about if you don't speak up, you're contributing to the oppression. It's maybe a silly example about a mouse, but it's such an obvious one as well. If you don't stop the elephant, the mouse is going to be hurt. Right, so yeah, absolutely, we need to be part of that and speak up and do something.
Professor Jacqui, any thoughts from you?
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with both Rachel and Tim in relation to the fact that we can't be neutral. And speaking from the South African context, everything we do is multicultural or cross-cultural. We don't live in a homogenous society at all. And so being able to talk about our own privilege, but also being able to use that in the service of people whose voices have been oppressed, is really important. And whilst I agree that one needs to stand against oppression and to advocate for people, it's how can we work collaboratively? How can we use our communication skills to speak the truth to power, but in a way that gets heard, so that we're not alienating people in power? It's a really challenging concept, and I really think that as counseling psychologists, we hear a lot of what's wrong, of the injustices in our therapy rooms. How can we move beyond that and think about where we might work collaboratively to engage, for example, in our country with government departments who are not delivering what they're supposed to be delivering? How can we use our positions of power and communication skills to actually engage with people in more powerful positions? So those are really important questions. And yeah, I have a couple of examples that I could mention later. I don't want to take up too much space. But this idea of how we use our positionality, how we reflect on how we are seen. I liked your comment, Tim, about one of your clients saying, I've never spoken about this with a white person. We have to speak about these uncomfortable things that are part of our legacy, but also take it further. And yeah, in the South African context, fortunately, I've just been in a session earlier today with trainees, and none of them look like me. None of them are white. None of them are English speaking as first language. And so how can we equip those people as well to take positions of advocacy and to speak for their clients? Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, perhaps you will be able to share those instances you mentioned just now. So a question around, I think Dr. Tim has asked some very relevant questions about challenging us and analyzing our blind spots in terms of what we do within our practice. What is the one thing we can do every day to make a difference, to advocate, to deal with these kind of issues? To what extent do we as a profession, or are we lacking as a profession in lobbying and advocating for things like governments who don't provide adequate services, who underfund services? How should we as a profession be responding to that as counseling psychologists specifically? Perhaps, Jacqui, have you got some ideas around that? Things like our Department of Health, NHI, professional board issues. To what extent as a body, as a lobby group, as a collective of counseling psychologists, do we get involved?
Thanks very much, Mike. I don't want to speak for our professional body because I consult with them, but I haven't had a very active role there. But certainly one of my great disappointments in South Africa, 30 plus years after democracy, is that our professional body has seemed to stay quiet on certain things. They have not, in my opinion, taken a position where they can stand against the lack of delivery of services, particularly in primary healthcare, particularly in relation to providing services for people's mental health. We have the policies in place, but we do not have the delivery. And I don't want to comment on future developments at this stage, but just to say that as a group, as a professional body, it has felt to me as if there's been too much silence from our professional body around injustices, that people have become comfortable because they're okay, and so they're not actually advocating enough for the disempowered, for the disenfranchised and the marginalized. And I think it should be done much more. We can talk about it at professional conferences, but it needs to happen much more at governmental levels, where we could use the power of the body, of our professional body, to actually be advocating for people, to be changing practice in many ways. It's multidisciplinary, multi-focused, multi-pronged. And I'd be interested to hear from anyone else who's had experience of working at that level, because certainly my experiences are working at a lower level, if you like, in community settings where you do it at a local level. So how can you move perhaps from local to regional and onwards? Those are our challenges. But let's just hear what others have to say, or other questions.
Who would like to go next, Dr. Tim or Professor Rachel?
I'm
I think
happy.
it's go on, Rachel.
No,
Okay,
go on. I
No,
insist this time.
Now, Professor
Okay.
Rachel, it's your turn.
Sorry, Michael.
I was just saying, I think it's Professor Rachel's turn. She
Oh,
spoke
okay.
slightly ahead.
Okay.
You were milliseconds in front.
Okay. I mean, I think really important points that you made, Jacqui, and I think very, very similar situation in the UK. I mean, one of the things that I've spent a lot of my career doing is actually building bridges with other disciplines. Because whilst I recognise that counselling psychology has a set of particular skills and so does psychology generally, we're still quite small fish in a pond. So I have spent my whole career trying to build with psychiatrists, with medicine, with social workers, and actually having a voice as a wider group, because I think it just makes us more powerful and more likely to initiate change.
I would agree
And then
with
if
that.
yeah, and if we then apply the same lens about how oppression trickles down, if our body doesn't speak up, as individual practitioners, it's going to feel very hard as well to then speak up, because I think a lot of people run into that instinct of, I don't want to go against my own body because what about my licensing, right? Right? That's almost another form of injustice or oppression there. That if our body speaks up about societal matters that are important, it can make a change, and we have an art there and science that we can avail of. I remember leading up to the equality marriage referendum in Ireland. Ireland was one of the two, I think, but certainly the first countries in the world that held a public referendum around voting yes or no for same-sex marriage. And it's one of the few times that the psychology body did publish a research paper speaking up against some of the misinformation being done around whatever the negative consequences would be from allowing same-sex marriage. And I suppose I'm really grateful, although it's one of the few times that they've spoken up. I'm really grateful that they did. I might not have moved to this country if it wasn't for that either, right? Because it might have influenced the vote, or it might have actually educated people who were in their own journey. And then just the point I'm trying to make here is how this trickles down to the divisions or the individual practitioners in the body itself. If our larger body doesn't speak up, how empowered do we feel to actually then do this?
Another question that popped up in my head as we were speaking here is, it was mentioned the APA is under tremendous pressure in the United States at the moment, with federal funding being cut off and pressure being applied regarding their efforts to achieve inclusivity and diversity. To what extent should we as a profession be supporting our colleagues in places like that, or should we remain focused on sovereign national matters, because we have, once again, a diversity of opinions that some people feel we should be supporting colleagues in other parts of the world who are being pressurized, and others feeling that we should not be meddling in the affairs of other states. So do you think advocacy should go so far as to be supporting colleagues internationally? Dr. Tim?
Right. So I suppose all I want to say here is that I witness a lot of people freezing when we touch on how large the injustice is, or how much stuff is happening in the world. And the thing I don't want to happen, and I think none of us want to happen, is the inaction. So there's something, and I don't quite have the phrase down yet, but there's something around just doing something. Sure, we're just one human, maybe, and maybe we join a collective or we join a group, and as a group we can do a little more. But if all of us do something, the world might be a much better place. So I think that speaks much less around, oh, should I stay in my own country or should I help my colleagues across the sea? Maybe some of us help our colleagues across the sea. Maybe some of us are here. Maybe some of us across the sea are not that interested in working for development there and are actually helping us. So if all of us are doing something, rather than the overwhelm kicking in and we feel so overwhelmed that we freeze in, but there's so much happening, then what do I do? And I've had these discussions with colleagues, right, where they're like, oh, why do you speak up about this issue, but not about that one? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I get it, but I'm also still one person. and they have a certain specialism or a certain focus. All of them matter.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, doing something rather than nothing is where I'm going for.
Right. Professor Rachel?
Yes, I'd actually, Tim has actually said much of what I was going to say about doing small things. But the other point I wanted to pick up is I sometimes struggle around the notion of empowerment is wonderful, but I think my answer to Michael's question would be it's what people from other countries want. It's not for us to offer, it's for them, because sometimes the power differential just gets replicated. We can be the equivalent of the white savior, which can be the middle class or the whatever savior. So I think it's about really listening and finding out what people want that can be most helpful, because I think sometimes our help can actually be unhelpful, even though it may come with the best intentions.
Mm. Professor Jacqui?
However, I mean, I agree with that. But I think that statements of solidarity with our colleagues are really important. And I'm thinking particularly of the community psychologists who a couple of years ago in the US, in one of their publications, had a statement from Europe saying we stand in solidarity for peace. And it was signed by multiple people, and it made a very, very firm statement, and then published in the US to say we're in solidarity with those of you who stand against oppression and violence and injustices and so on. So I think we have to think about where, bigger collegial statements can be of value. And I'm aware that they've been used at various points over the last few decades, just for people to feel encouraged that they're not on their own and not being left alone. So I think, Tim, your point about we freeze, but then how can we collegially and collaboratively perhaps give signs of solidarity?
Absolutely. And holding on to that phrase of nothing about us without us, right? Like you're saying as well, Rachel. It's such a powerful phrase. I think it took me some time to fully comprehend the gravity of that quote, like, nothing about us without us. Right? So whatever population we're talking about, our privilege might be that we have knowledge, or we know research, or we know how to do research if it's not done. But it's including the people that we're talking about. Not just about them, because then, like you're saying, Rachel, we're just replicating the oppression and the inequality.
Yeah, I think it's a critical point you make there, Dr. Tim. I've been on 2 webinars in the last month, which emphasized that point, one of which was on patient-led care for pain management, where the patient's voice needs to be heard. And the second one was yesterday, actually. It was an MPS webinar on AI, on responsibly managing AI and how do we use AI. And the message was very powerfully brought home that no matter what we do with AI, we still have to consult with the patient. So yes, perhaps what we're going to do at this moment right now is I'd like to invite the other members of our forum who meet regularly every month. Michael in Australia, Yatunda in the UK. I see Charles in Australia is present. I can't see all the participants on the screen at the moment, so if I've missed anyone, I apologize, but please come on and join the discussion. And if anyone has questions or comments they'd like to make right now, please use the raise hand function, and then I'll come to you and we can take those comments from the people with their hands up. If you don't know where it is, if you go down to react, the little heart shape at the bottom of your screen, and you click on it, it allows you to raise your hand. So, Yatunda, Michael, Charles. Well, thank you for that deafening round of silence.
Well, hi everyone. I'm just going to say thank you to our panelists first and foremost, and thank you to Tim for such an amazing presentation. My question relates to something that Tim, you said earlier on, which is knowing, where do you come from as a practitioner, and how that influences or impacts or adds or takes away from the relationship that you're able to build in the therapy room. I'm just really curious whether you could say a little bit more about what do you mean. There's parts of me that thinks you talk about individual therapy, therapist identity, and what adds to their being, but perhaps there's more to it than my assumption is allowing me to get to.
I think that's certainly a big part of it. I suppose I revert back to the wheel of power and privilege. It's even, scaling yourself from there and just being aware. I think it's good practice sometimes to sort of draw a wheel like that between yourself and your client, preferably with the client as a dialogue, and might be very helpful, but even in your own supervision or something, and just reflecting on like, okay, how may we have similarities, or how are we different? And what might the impact of that be? What may go unsaid, right? It's maybe also inviting the person about what parts of you don't go as acknowledged in other therapy experiences, for example. What parts would you like to really bring out in this space? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think there's a lot in there, right? Around self-reflection, knowing yourself. And it's this humility stance of always reflecting and also owning I am who I am, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But but we're meeting as two different people, and can we own that we're different people? Yet we may have so much empathy for each other and may really feel connected and so much rapport, which I think there's also a beauty in it to then be able to relate that much while acknowledging, gosh, we're so different and we come from such different worlds or different lives, and yet we really get each other. Isn't that wonderful? Right? So rather than, oh, I'm a therapist, I'm neutral, my personality or my education, my background doesn't matter, right? Whereas I think it certainly does. And doesn't mean it's bad, again. It's just acknowledging it's part of you. There's also this quote, just actually from my colleague, and I don't know, she may have read it somewhere, but it's my co-author, Dominic, from the article, who said around, all our bodies have experienced some form of oppression. So it's also tapping into your own like empathy on that level, whatever kind of oppression, maybe it's gender-based, maybe it's sexuality-based or race-based or class-based, right? And we may bring that out as a way of connecting as well. I don't know if that's answering your question, Tim.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
You're on mute, Mark. Just to forewarn you, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm self-employed. I'm having a staff conversation with myself. Thank you for that. Yeah, perhaps I don't see any hands up yet, but perhaps we can go around the table and see if Dr. Ashutosh from India has anything to add.
Thanks, Mike, and congratulations, team, for such a wonderful presentation and followed by wonderful deliberations. But this discussion created a dilemma in my mind, because neutrality was something, if we hold it, it's easy, because we are not aligning with anything. But the kind of political environment we live in, if we look at from one side's perspective, they are having their own genuine reasons. The other perspective is having their own genuine reason. And letting our own values and judgments come into the picture, leaving neutrality and becoming inclined towards the person whom or the group whom we think is a victim. So it's actually whom we think, and it keeps changing with time, with changing geopolitical scenarios. So it's very complicated to maintain the balance. So I was thinking that, I'm not sure how to come to a balance with this change. Let's say today Ukraine and Russia are fighting. Maybe a couple of months down the line, they do a treaty, and then things start changing in a different way. And now I'm nowhere. So how to bring in this balance? It's a question that is coming to my mind. I don't know how to address this dilemma. Anybody
I think
can.
it's a very honest acknowledgement that there's something deceptively simple around the neutrality. And I haven't thought of that in a little while. But there's something about it that feels maybe lighter for us as clinicians to hold the neutrality, and we don't need to be that involved, or we don't need to have opinions about what's right or wrong. Whereas I think most of us, when we step out of the room, we have opinions about what's right or wrong. So yeah, I just wanted to speak to that part that you're saying, Ashutosh. It seems deceptively simple, maybe, right? To hold the neutrality, but is it genuine? Is it authentic? I'm not sure.
Can I just add to that, Tim? Just curious. Sorry, Ashutosh, I just realized I cut you off. You continue, please.
I was saying either way it finds complicated. It doesn't, give us a clarity on how to proceed. Because maintaining neutrality is difficult. And taking side is even more complicated. So
Michael, go ahead.
Think how to.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to build on that idea of neutrality and think a little bit about how that might be incorporated in a higher education context when you're sort of teaching or training students. And often there is that tension there that people don't want to offend. I know as an academic, you often have to be careful about language and don't want to inadvertently offend. And students can often feel that way in a diverse learning environment. So I guess I'm interested really to everyone on the panel around ideas around how that can be integrated into a training context, around any ideas or principles to sort of start to normalize that, or how that might be sort of set up in a learning environment.
Ooh.
I mean, may I answer that?
Yeah, Professor, yes.
I mean, one of the things we do, and I don't think it's perfect by any stretch of imagination, but we start by doing some contracting, which all the students sign, and we talk about things like recognizing difference and being able to have that conversation. And that starts from actually day one of the training. And it does seem to enable some difficult conversations to go on. And we're not going to agree about things because we are such a diverse population. I don't know if that helps at all. And also having a reflective space within the program where those can be discussed.
Right. Thanks, Rachel.
Michael, it's Maureen here. Hi. Sorry, I just can't find my my hand to put up. I just want to say thank you to the presenters and to Tim especially. It was a really thought-provoking presentation. And I was just thinking there around the students. I mean, in Ireland, counselling psychology has historically been self-funded. So that in itself selected people who could only afford to pay for the training and support themselves during their training. Now, we've recently, we've moved now to a funding model, which I think will make it more accessible, counselling psychology more accessible to those who maybe, say, financially wouldn't have in the past been able to afford to do it. So I think that in itself will probably bring more diversity and also kind of allow for that broader experience as well among the students, life experience and all the challenges that you were talking about and mentioned, Tim. So that landscape hopefully will change for us. But it's really lovely to be reminded again about all the things we as practitioners need to reflect on and keep in mind. So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for that, Maureen. The very reason that Harvard University is currently being investigated by the US federal administration for inclusivity. I see Natalia has her hand up. Natalia, please go ahead.
Hello, yeah, just a question. I don't know if it's gonna get an answer, but just something that really is in my mind. I'm a trainee counseling psychologist, and I'm actually studying this module now. And what I find with this module about social justice, diversity, and inclusion is that there's a lot of resistance. And I don't know why it evokes so many strong reactions in people. And I was wondering, what do you think it is? What is the barrier? What is the resistance? You see people thinking like, oh, we have to do this as part of there's not really an engagement or an actual interest to learn or to develop this side as a counseling psychologist. It's like, oh, we have to tick this box, and it's so annoying kind of feeling that I get when we're talking about this in the classroom.
I think you're absolutely right. There is a great degree of resistance that people want to sort of withdraw behind the neutrality screen or curtain. And so you're right, it is a difficult conversation, but there is a resistance. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. Maybe Dr. Tim, Professor Rachel, and Professor Jacqui have some ideas on how we could diffuse that resistance.
I'm happy to come in here for a little. I agree that there is resistance, and I think some of the resistance comes from students' previous experiences of psychology, which has been very conservative, very conventional, very positivistic, which hasn't engaged them as individuals. And so I think that the resistance in some ways is quite natural because it's a fear of exposing ourselves, a fear of looking at our own positionalities, a fear of looking at our privilege, all of those sorts of things. And I think it's a developmental process, and I'm reflecting here on my own process. I was fortunate in my training in the late 80s to be in a department which was staffed by people who'd been part of OASA, which was the Organization for Alternate Social Services in South Africa, which really tried to provide psychological services to people who'd been victims of violence of the apartheid regime. And so in some ways, having those sorts of colleagues made an enormous difference, because for them, they had no doubt about their need to stand up for the oppressed. But that's not necessarily the case in all departments. And when I moved to the UK, I was quite stunned at the apolitical nature of psychology that was back in the noughties, which is why we established a community psychology section of the BPS. And I think that with small voices, we've managed to speak to more powerful people in the BPS and other places around the need for psychology to stand up against oppression and in solidarity with people who are marginalized. So it seems to me that the dialogue has shifted, but it is a developmental process. And I guess we have to almost sometimes wait for people to be exposed to their consulting rooms, to empathizing with people who've really struggled, that they haven't necessarily had those experiences yet. But nevertheless, we must persevere and expose people to the injustices that exist in all of our societies. So my little bit there.
Yatunda, I see your hand, and Nancy. Perhaps I could just run past Dr. Tim and Professor Rachel quickly before I go to Yatunda's hand up first, and then Nancy.
Yes, I mean, I totally agree, and Jacqui put it far more articulately than I might have done. But I agree with that. And I suppose it's also, for me, it's something about, these aren't the right words, but bear with me, how it's sold, how it's positioned, because I think people do feel very, very threatened by their own privilege being exposed. So I think it's part of how that's done, that it actually is made to feel really relevant to everyone, and that people won't be shamed or humiliated or whichever side or wherever they say in any continuum of privilege.
Yeah, very well said, Rachel and Jacqueline. The only thing I'd add to that is, well, I think actually, Rachel, you're saying that is sometimes we forget to acknowledge how talking and processing EDI or JEDI is also beneficial to those with more privilege. It's also helpful to those who have power and privilege. And sometimes we forget to acknowledge that. I certainly tried, and happy for feedback there in the talk earlier, to acknowledge that privilege isn't a bad thing, right? Which I think is often inadvertently what's communicated, as if having privilege is therefore bad, rather than almost selling it as in this isn't a benefit to everyone, those who are more marginalized, but also those who have fewer marginalizations or more power, because now you have a choice, or maybe by the end of the day or something, right? Yeah, hope that makes sense. Don't know if I'm, yes.
Right. So we can just go to Yatunda, then Nancy, and then Catherine, and then I think we have to start wrapping up for today because people have other obligations to move on to. So Yatunda, over to you.
I wanted to invite a different thought, perhaps, to Natalia's question around trainees and maybe resistance. And I'm often taken aback sometimes when we talk about social justice and the emphasis seems to shift to trainees. But I would invite the emphasis also to be on trainers and the fear that they have equally to engage with social justice or injustice, but also their positions of power and how perhaps that could be interpreted. Once upon a time, I was a trainee myself, and I was acutely aware of the power and privilege that my trainers had for me as a trainee, and the lack of modeling, I suppose, at the time that I perceived that my trainers did not have. And I wondered where that sits in this conversation. There is a balance between what trainees bring, absolutely, but also what trainers bring, the biases that trainers bring, the misconceptions that, trainers bring, the fear that trainers bring. Yes, they want to be the best trainers that they possibly can. They maybe want to inspire, but there is also unresolved issues with our trainers. And my concern sometimes is around how trainers maybe, and I say maybe, are not necessarily open to the level of self-awareness and scrutiny that they put trainees under. It was just a thought that I wanted to share.
Thanks for that, Yatunda. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you. Excellent discussion. I'm working in a space where I work with a lot of gender diverse and neurodiverse clients, and currently in Australia, in Queensland, where there's a lot of a lot of conflict at the moment about provision of services to trans people, children and adolescents particularly. And I've noticed, I've been sort of in a political zone for a long time, and I've noticed a lot of division and a lot of conflict within the people who are on the left, who are sort of socially aware, but there's lots of long ingrained divisions. And depending on sort of, where people became politicized and sort of how people have sort of entered into the debate, into the sort of fight, how people, so, the questions around how decisions are made and how collaboration happens and how conflict is managed become really crucial in sort of navigating, like us as a clinic, sort of navigating sort of the whole advocacy and social justice process. So I was just wondering sort of what your thoughts are. Like you talked, Rachel, you mentioned contracting. That sort of was an interesting bit, but these difficult conversations and the real sort of, real inclusion, the decision making, sort of who makes the decisions, how they're made, like about protests, about sort of new actions that are happening, about sort of fundraising, about all sorts of different things, and like maybe that setting up sort of communication processes for people or ways to have those difficult conversations or to bring people, together. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Would any of our panelists like to comment on that? Well, while you think about that quickly, perhaps we can just move on to Catherine quickly. If you can unmute yourself, Catherine, what is it you'd like to raise?
Yes, thank you. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and all the people who are contributing discussions about this issue. It's not something that I've been actively involved with yet, and I've been working and training and in the whole psychology field for many years. And I'm a counselling psychologist, and here in Australia, we don't have in the training programs a huge focus actually on the issue of social justice. I think that kind of comes through more from the community psych area in Australia. It's not that as if it doesn't get talked about, but it doesn't get talked about enough, and it doesn't get talked about explicitly. And I think that's what I'm really picking up on from attending this today, about the absolute importance of saying what we see, of saying what we feel. And I think, in our training, we get to learn how to do that therapeutically, how to make use of that for the client's benefit, not just for discharging our own discomfort. And as you guys are talking about the difficulties and the reluctance of voicing what we see, of recognising social injustices, I was thinking about how I'm kind of positioning this topic in my mind as another source of vulnerability for individuals. Kind of take away the dirty connotations or the mean connotations or the shaming connotations that people seem to have about that idea of, another thing to have to say. Because I've certainly heard that from early career psychologists, as in another thing for me to have to confront in myself and in my client. I feel overwhelmed already. And as I hear about it or position it as a framework for another framework for understanding vulnerability or trauma from a systemic source, doesn't seem so scary to say. So that was my observation from what I've been hearing today.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps the panelists, if anyone had a thought on Nancy's question, and then we do need to bring things to a close for today. We've run over by 7 minutes already. So I think then we have to wrap things up. Any comments, final comments from the panelists? Tim?
Yeah, I love that reframe, Catherine, to acknowledge the systemic element in it, and it's almost a lower key to sell it and still be able to talk about the same challenges, right? So I think that's a great reframe, because I hear the resistance, right, that many people have in this area. Whereas, context in intergenerational trauma, seeing the person in their life, those concepts we already know and we're familiar with. So let's bring those in and acknowledge them. And as I was thinking about what you raised, Nancy, I jotted some things down, and it sounds like a really tough fight you're fighting and that you're involved in. And I suppose part that I wanted to acknowledge that maybe I didn't speak too much in this keynote this morning, but it's about, let's not underestimate the amount of self-care we need while doing this, while speaking up for what we believe is right, or what the gender recognition that you're fighting for, Nancy, that, I truly hope you have a community or a sense of people and colleagues that you can lean on, and as well, that self-care that needs to be part of it, because this might be a thing that's going to last a little while until we're maybe at a milestone that you're hoping for. But yeah, mind yourself in that as well, because activism burnout is also a real thing, right? To be so burned out yourself and defeated or pessimistic or cynical because we feel just so unheard and we're knocking on that door and it's not budging. So mind yourself in that process. I hope that speaks to a little bit of what you're saying.
Okay. Thanks for that, Tim. Heather, unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we're not going to be able to take any more questions for today. But I would like to, in closing, thank our panelists for taking the time out to attend. We really appreciate taking time out of your schedules to come and talk to us today. Thank you so much for that. To the members of the forum who've put this all together, the folk who've put in all the background work to make it happen, people like Michael de Mattia, Yotunda, Dr. Ashutosh, Chloe O'Donoghue, who's not with us here today because you're not feeling well. But thank you for those people that have actually pulled all the strings together to make this possible today. I think it's been extremely useful. I know I've personally benefited from this discussion. It's been very thought-provoking. So I'd like to thank everyone who's attended as well for taking the time out. I'm really encouraged to see people from all around the world getting together here and networking in the interest of counseling psychology and the communities we serve. So thank you very much for that. Keep a lookout with your professional associations nationally. We will hopefully be putting on another webinar closer towards the end of the year. That's not finalized yet, but hopefully we'll pull something together later in the year. And we hope to see all of you there again as well. So thank you so much. And we can perhaps bring the seminar to an end, albeit 10 minutes over time. But please don't shoot me for that.